A boot kicked the screen door open. Cardboard boxes tumbled down the porch steps. A coffee mug shattered on the concrete, sending ceramic shards across the walkway like shrapnel. A pair of hands reached out and caught an old leather jacket before it could hit the dirt. The hands were weathered knuckles thick from a lifetime of gripping wrenches and motorcycle bars. They belonged to a woman with white hair pulled back in a single tight braid. Her name was Marlo Beckett. She was 75 years old, and she didn't cry. Two men in khaki polo shirts with a bank logo stitched across the chest carried her life out of the house she had lived in for 40 years. They were polite about it. That somehow made it worse. They called her ma'am. They asked if she needed help loading the truck. She shook her head and watched them stack 4 decades of memories onto the lawn like they were clearing out a storage unit. By sunset that day, Marlo had $83 in her pocket, a 1974 Harley shovelhead that barely started, and a single brass key on a chain around her neck, a key to her grandmother's garage, a garage that nobody had opened in 26 years. What was inside that garage would change everything. The men who emptied her house wore name tags, Dennis and Kyle. They worked for the bank now, but they'd probably worked construction or retail before this. Young enough to still believe a paycheck was just a paycheck. Old enough to know when to keep their mouths shut. Marlo stood on the driveway and watched them load a rocking chair Frank had built in 1987. Watched them carry out the dining table where Claire had done her homework every night for 12 years. Watched them stack boxes labeled kitchen, bedroom, garage in neat rows like they were organizing a warehouse. She didn't tell them to be careful, didn't ask them to slow down. She just stood there with the jacket in her hands and let it happen. The jacket was heavy, real leather broken in over decades. It had patches sewn onto the back and sleeves. Club patches, event patches, a faded Iron Maiden's crest over the left breast. She hadn't worn it in 15 years. Not since the last time she'd ridden with the club. Not since she'd sold the shop and tried to pretend she was someone else. Someone who didn't need the road. She put it on now. The leather creaked as she slid her arms through the sleeves. It still fit. Barely. She zipped it halfway and felt the weight settle onto her shoulders like an old memory coming home. Her daughter had done this. Not the bank. Not Dennis and Kyle in their polo shirts. Claire. 3 years ago, Claire had come to her with a story. Her husband had a problem. Just temporary. Just a bad month. Just needed a signature on a small loan to cover things until the next paycheck came through. Marlo had signed. She hadn't read the paperwork. That was the part that kept her up at night. Not the betrayal, not even the money. The fact that she had signed a piece of paper her own daughter put in front of her without reading a single word. She had run Beckett's motorcycle repair for 30 years. She had haggled with customers over labor costs. She had chased down deadbeats who thought they could skip out on a bill. She had won arguments with parts suppliers twice her size who tried to shortchange her on orders. And she had signed a document without reading it because her daughter asked her to. Claire's husband had gambled the loan money away in 6 weeks. Then he'd opened another line of credit using Marlo's name. Then another. He'd used the equity in her house as collateral without her knowledge, forged her signature on documents, and bled her dry. Then he'd run. Disappeared out of state with $30,000 in cash and a girlfriend nobody knew about. Claire had followed him. She'd called once from somewhere in Nevada to say she was fine, that she'd be back soon, that she'd fix things. She never called again. The house went into foreclosure 8 months later. Marlo fought it for 2 years. She hired lawyers she couldn't afford. She tried to refinance with banks that wouldn't touch her. She sold the motorcycle shop for half of what it was worth and poured every cent into payments that barely made a dent. None of it worked. The numbers were too big. Her income was too small. By the time the final notice came, she cashed out her retirement account, sold every tool she owned. She was working part-time at an auto parts counter for $11 an hour, just trying to keep the lights on. The last thing she packed was the leather jacket. She'd left it hanging in the hall closet for years, buried under winter coats and boxes of things she'd never use. Now she pulled it out and held it up to the light. The patches were faded but still legible. Daytona, Sturgis, Pikes Peak. Names of roads and rallies and runs that felt like they'd happened in another lifetime. Another world. She'd been riding since 1967, 57 years. She'd ridden with 3 different clubs over the decades. She'd been one of the first women patched into the Iron Maiden's motorcycle club, Back when that meant something. Back when it meant fighting for every mile. Her road name was Beckett, not because it was clever, because the guys couldn't think of anything more original, and she didn't care enough to argue. She hadn't worn the jacket in 15 years. Hadn't needed to. But she put it on now and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been buried under 2 years of lawyer bills and foreclosure notices and sleepless nights. The Harley in the driveway was a 1974 shovelhead, cherry red with black trim. Original paint or close enough. It needed work. It always needed work. The carburetor had a slow leak that made it run rich. The kickstart was getting harder every year. One of the cylinders wasn't firing clean, but it ran. On a good day, it ran. Marlo walked over to the bike and ran her hand along the gas tank. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun. She could feel the vibration of the engine in her bones before she even turned the key. She swung her leg over the seat and settled her weight. The leather creaked. The frame groaned. She put her foot on the kickstart and pressed down once. Twice. On the third kick, the engine caught. It coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a sound like rolling thunder. Dennis looked up from the truck. Kyle stopped halfway through carrying a box. They both stared at her like they weren't sure what they were seeing. Marlo didn't look at them. She twisted the throttle once, felt the engine respond, then eased the bike into gear. She rode. The county road took her north out of town past the strip mall where she used to buy groceries, past the high school where Claire had played softball in a uniform that was always 2 sizes too big, past the cemetery where Franklin Beckett had been buried for 19 years under a flat stone marker that just said his name and his dates. She didn't stump at any of it, and she kept the throttle steady and let the wind pull the heat out of her skin. The houses thinned out as the road climbed into the hills. Sagebrush replaced lawns. Red rock formations rose up on either side of the highway like ancient sentinels. The air smelled like dust and juniper and gasoline. She rode for 40 minutes until the pavement turned to dirt, and the dirt turned into a narrow track that wound up through the scrub. No signs, no markers, just a road she'd driven 100 times and hadn't thought about in years. The property sat at the end of the track, 5 acres of Arizona hillside that her grandmother, Evangeline, had bought in 1946 for almost nothing. There was no house on it. There had never been a house on it. There was only one structure, a concrete block garage, 20 feet by 40, heavy steel door, no windows. It had been painted white once. Now it was mostly gray, the paint blistered and peeling from decades of sun and wind. Evangeline Beckett had owned that garage until the day she died in 1998. She'd been 90 years old, sharp as a blade until the very end. In her will, she'd left the property to Marlo, not to Marlo's mother, who was still alive at the time, not to Marlo's older brother, to Marlo, specifically. The will had come with one instruction handwritten on a separate piece of paper in Evangeline's careful script. Don't open it until you have nothing left. Marlo had read that line in a lawyer's office 26 years ago and laughed. Her grandmother had always been strange. Riddles and warnings, long silences, a look in her eye like she was remembering something nobody else could see. For 26 years, the garage had sat there. Marlo had paid the property tax on it every year. $180. She paid it out of stubbornness more than anything else. She'd driven up to the property, sometimes stood outside the door, looked at the lock. But she'd never used the key. Now she had nothing left. She killed the engine and let the silence settle around her. The wind moved through the dry grass behind the garage. A hawk circled overhead, wings spread wide against the pale sky. Marlo swung her leg off the bike and put the kickstand down. The key was warm against her chest, tucked under her shirt on a thin chain. She lifted it over her head and held it in her palm. The brass had darkened with age, turned almost black in places, but the teeth were still sharp, still clean. She walked to the door, her boots crunched on the gravel. The sun was behind her now, casting her shadow long across the concrete. She didn't feel hope. She didn't feel curiosity. She felt tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. The kind that comes from being beaten down so many times you stop flinching when the next blow lands. Whatever was in this garage, it wouldn't be enough to fix what was broken. That was what she believed when she slid the key into the lock. She was wrong about that. The key turned smooth. The lock clicked. The hasp dropped off with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty hillside. For a moment, Marlowe stood there with her hand on the door listening. There was no sound except the wind and the faint tick of the Harley's engine cooling behind her. She pulled the door open. The hinges screamed, rust and metal grinding against metal, a sound like something waking up after a long sleep. A wall of cool, dry air rolled out. The garage had been sealed tight for 26 years. The air inside was different, heavier, older. Marlowe stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The only light came from the open door behind her. Shapes resolved slowly out of the darkness. Tall shapes along the walls. Square shapes stacked on shelves. A long, low shape in the center of the room covered with a heavy canvas tarp. She found the breaker box on the wall near the door and threw the main switch. The lights came on one by one, old fluorescent tubes mounted to the ceiling. They hummed and flickered before they caught, casting a cold white light that filled the space and pushed the shadows into the corners. Marlowe stopped breathing. The walls of the garage were lined with trophies, not 3 or 4, not 10, dozens of them. Brass and silver, some as tall as a man, some no bigger than a coffee cup. They sat on wooden shelves that looked like they'd been built by hand decades ago. The labels had yellowed, but the lettering was still readable. First place, Daytona Beach Sand Races, 1937. Women's Champion, Wisconsin TT, 1938. First place, Pikes Peak Hill Climb, Class B, 1940. Marlowe walked slowly along the wall, reading the dates, reading the events. Her boots echoed on the concrete floor. Each trophy had a small engraved plate at the base. The name on every single one was the same. Evangeline Beckett. Evangeline Beckett. Evangeline Beckett. Marlowe's grandmother had been a motorcycle racer. Not a hobbyist, not a weekend rider, a champion, a national champion, in an era when women weren't supposed to be on motorcycles at all. Marlowe had been riding bikes for 57 years. She'd spent 3 decades in the motorcycle business. She'd met racers and builders and collectors from all over the country, and she had never heard a single word about this. She turned in a slow circle, taking it in. The garage was a shrine. Framed photographs covered the back wall, black and white, brown sepia, images frozen in time. A young woman in leather and goggles standing beside a long, low motorcycle. The same woman crouched over the handlebars at full lean on a oval dirt spraying out behind the rear wheel. The same woman standing on a podium, accepting a trophy from a man in a suit while a crowd cheered behind her. The woman in the photographs was her grandmother, 20 years old, 25, 30, young and strong and alive in a way Marlowe had never seen. She walked to the center of the room. The canvas tarp covered something big. She knew what it was before she touched it. She could see the outline, the curve of a fuel tank, the spoke of a wheel. She grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled it back. The motorcycle underneath was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was an Indian, not one of the modern reissues, an original. The paint was a deep cherry red that hadn't faded a single shade because nobody had ever exposed it to sunlight. The chrome was perfect. The leather saddle was cracked in places, but still intact, still shaped to the rider who'd sat on it decades ago. The fuel tank was hand-painted with gold pinstriping and a number inside a white circle. Number 7. A small brass plate was riveted to the frame near the engine. Indian Motorcycle Company, Springfield, Massachusetts, 1936, engine type 4. Marlowe knew what a 1936 Indian 4 was worth. Every serious biker knew. They came up for auction maybe once a decade. The last one she'd heard about had sold for close to $500,000. And this one was in better condition than that one. She put her hand on the leather seat. She didn't sit down. It felt like sitting down in a church, like something you didn't do without permission. There was a workbench against the far wall. On the workbench, beside an oil can and a set of carburetor jets laid out in careful order, was a wooden box, plain unvarnished, about the size of a shoebox. Marlowe walked over and opened it. Inside was a journal bound in black leather, a stack of letters tied with twine. A racing patch faded and frayed at the edges, a gold pocket watch with a scratched crystal, and an envelope with her name on the front, written in her grandmother's handwriting. Marlowe. She sat down on the workbench. Dust rose up around her. She could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. She opened the envelope first. The letter inside was dated August of 1998, 1 year before Evangeline died. The handwriting was steady, each letter perfectly formed. Her grandmother had been 90 years old when she wrote it. Marlo, if you are reading this, you are out of choices. I am sorry. I knew this day might come for you. The Beckett women have always been hard on themselves and easy on the people who hurt us. I was the same. Your mother was the same. I hope your daughter is not, but I think she may be. So I left you what I had. Number 7 was my best ride. She is yours now. There are letters in this box from men who tried to take her from me. One of them was a banker. His son is still alive. He will come for her again when he learns she exists. Be ready. Love, Grandma. Marlo read the letter twice. Then she sat very still, staring at the words on the page. She looked at the trophies on the wall. She looked at the Indian motorcycle gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She looked at the date on the letter again. She breathed out for what felt like the first time in a year. She picked up the gold pocket watch from the box and held it in her palm. It was warm as if it had been sitting in sunlight instead of sealed in darkness for 26 years. She wound it 3 turns. The mechanism inside clicked and whirred. The second hand began to move. Marlo stood up. She walked to the door of the garage and stood there for a long time looking out at the hills and the dirt road and her old Harley parked in the weeds. She did not cry. She smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 2 years. She said it out loud to nobody. Okay, Grandma. Okay. She turned back into the garage. There was a workbench that hadn't been touched in 26 years. Tools hanging on pegboard that were older than she was. A history she hadn't known existed until 10 minutes ago. She walked over to the workbench and picked up a rag, started wiping down the surface. Dust came away in thick streaks, revealing wood underneath that was scarred and stained but still solid. That was when she heard the engines. 2 of them. Coming up the dirt road. Fast. Marlo walked to the door and looked out. 2 pickup trucks, black and lifted high beams cutting through the late afternoon light. They came up the road without slowing down and pulled into the clearing in front of the garage like they owned it. 4 men got out. 3 of them she had never seen before. Big men in jeans and work boots. The kind of men who got paid to stand behind someone and look intimidating. The 4th man she recognized. She'd seen his face on a billboard along the county highway. Younger than her by 20 years. Broad shoulders, expensive haircut, a suit jacket worn over a polo shirt like he was trying to split the difference between professional and approachable. The kind of man who smiled when he shook your hand and calculated what you were worth while he did it. Marlo stepped out of the garage and pulled the door closed behind her. Not all the way, just enough. The man walked towards her with his hand already extended like they were meeting at a business lunch. Mrs. Beckett, I'm Holden Ravencroft Development. I think we may have spoken on the phone last spring. Marlo didn't move a bum, didn't take his hand. We didn't speak. You left a message, right? Holden's smile didn't falter. He lowered his hand and gestured at the property around them like he was admiring it. Well, I'm here now. Look, I'll get straight to the point. My understanding is the county is moving to condemn this parcel. Environmental issues, soil contamination from the previous use. I don't know what your grandmother was doing out here, but the county's concerned about it. I would hate to see you lose the land for nothing. He paused, waited for her to ask a question. She didn't. I'm prepared to offer cash today. $40,000. We can close within the week. You walk away clean and you don't have to deal with the county coming after you for cleanup costs. Marlo looked at him. Then she looked past him at the 3 men standing by the trucks. Then she looked back at Holden. She didn't say anything. Holden took her silence for hesitation. He stepped a little closer, lowered his voice like they were sharing a secret. Mrs. Beckett, with respect, I know your situation. The house in town, the foreclosure. I'm offering you a way to land on your feet here. You take this money, you walk away, everybody wins. Marlo spoke for the first time. Her voice was flat, not a question, a statement. What's inside the garage? Holden blinked. His smile wavered for just a second. I'm sorry. You know what's inside the garage. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. She took a step toward him. He didn't move back, but something in his posture shifted. Your father knew. He tried to buy it from my grandmother in 1962. She turned him down. He came back in 1971 with 2 men and a court order that didn't hold. She turned him down again. She wrote it all down. I have the letters. The smile dropped off Holden's face. Mrs. Beckett, this is not a hostile conversation. I'm offering you good money. Marlowe's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I said, get off my property. One of the men standing by the trucks took a step forward. He was the biggest of the three, broad across the chest, with a scar cutting through one eyebrow. He didn't say anything. He just stepped forward and folded his arms. Marlowe looked at him, looked right at him. Then she looked back at Holden. Mr. Ravencroft, I have been riding motorcycles since you were in diapers. I have been thrown off bridges, beaten with chains, and shot at twice. I have buried 3 husbands and 1 daughter who isn't dead yet. You don't scare me. She pulled an old flip phone out of her jacket pocket, the kind with actual buttons, the kind nobody used anymore. You have 1 minute to be back in those trucks. After that, I make a phone call. The people who answer that phone are not in suits. Holden stared at her. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind picked up, pulling dust across the clearing. Then Holden turned to his men. We'll come back when she's had time to think. They got back in the trucks. The engines roared to life. They reversed down the dirt road in a cloud of dust tail lights disappearing around the bend. Marlowe stood there with the phone in her hand. She didn't put it away. She called a number she hadn't called in 11 years. A man's voice answered on the second ring. Deep, rough, like gravel sliding down a slope. Beckett, you still alive? Yeah, Judd, still alive. What do you need? I need 8 or 10 guys at my grandmother's place by tomorrow morning. Trouble's coming? What kind of trouble? Suits. The line was silent for 2 seconds. Lock the door, Beckett. We'll be there by sunup. He hung up. Marlowe put the phone away. She stood there for another minute looking down the dirt road where the trucks had disappeared. Then she turned and walked back into the garage. She spent the rest of the night there. She didn't sleep. She read the journal. Evangeline had started it in 1934, the year she bought the Indian. The first entry was short, just a few lines. Paid $200 for the bike. Rode her home in the rain. Nobody thought I'd make it. I made it. The next entry was longer, about her first race, a county fair circuit somewhere in Wisconsin. She'd signed up under the name E. Beckett because they wouldn't let a woman enter. She'd kept the helmet on until after she won. She wrote about her first crash, about hitting the dirt at 40 miles an hour and getting back up with a broken collarbone and finishing the race anyway. She wrote about the first time a man at a track tried to ban her from competing, about the argument, about the way she'd walked onto the track anyway and beaten every rider there. She wrote about the second time a man tried it, about how that one ended differently. The entries went on for years. Races won. Crashes survived. Men who couldn't believe a woman could ride like that. Men who tried to take the bike. Men who tried to take more than the bike. Then the war came and the entries changed. Racing stopped in 1942. Evangeline wrote about it like someone had died. No more races, no more crowds, just the bike and the road and the silence. But then something else started. Something Marlowe had never heard about. Evangeline had been recruited, not by the military, by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the agency that would later become the CIA. They needed couriers, people who could carry documents across the country without attracting attention, people who could ride routes nobody else would take. Nobody suspected a woman on a motorcycle of carrying anything important. Evangeline had spent 3 years riding the Indian 4 across the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, California, carrying classified documents in saddlebags and hidden compartments, riding through deserts and over mountains and along back roads that didn't show up on any map. She'd been good at it, good enough that they decorated her. Quietly, off the record. Marlowe closed the journal and opened the wooden box again. At the bottom, under the letters in the racing patch, was a small velvet pouch. She opened it. 3 medals, tarnished but intact, each one stamped with an eagle and a shield and a date. Marlowe held one of them in her hand and laughed out loud in the emptied garage. A short, sharp sound that echoed off the concrete walls. Her grandmother, the strange old woman who never talked about the past, the one with the riddles and the warnings and the silence. She'd been a spy. Marlowe kept reading. The journal went on past the war, past the racing, into the years when Evangeline had come out here and built this garage and filled it with things nobody else thought were important. The journal named names: Thaddeus Ravencroft, banker, Prescott, Arizona. Came to the property in 1962. offered $10,000 for the Indian, told me it was a fair price, told me I didn't know what I had. I told him to leave. He came back in 1971, brought two men with him, brought a document that claimed I owed the bank money, claimed he had a lien on the property. I called the sheriff. The document was a forgery. He left, built himself a bank anyway, built himself a fortune, raised a son. I wrote it all down, just in case. Marlo turned the page. There was more. The Indian 4 isn't the only thing in this garage. She looked up from the journal, looked at the workbench. She'd assumed the toolbox sitting on top was just a toolbox, old tools her grandfather had used before he died in the war. She stood up and walked over to it, lifted the toolbox off the bench. Underneath, set into the wood of the workbench itself, was a small brass ring, a handle, a trapdoor. Marlo pulled on this brass ring. The section of workbench lifted away, hinged on one side. Underneath was a hollow space, maybe 3 feet deep, lined with cedar planks. A small wooden ladder led down into the darkness. Marlo climbed down. The space at the bottom was the size of a small closet. The air was even drier than upstairs, cool and still. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were full, not full of whole motorcycles, full of parts, frames, tanks, engine cases, all of them carefully wrapped in oilcloth and labeled in her grandmother's handwriting. Marlo pulled the cloth off one frame. She recognized it immediately. A Crocker, a 1939 Crocker. There had been only about 100 of those ever built. The last one she'd heard about had sold at auction for $700,000. She pulled the cloth off another piece, a fuel tank, Brow Superior, the kind T.E. Lawrence had been riding when he died. Another, a complete, unrestored Vincent Black Lightning engine. Marlo sat down on the floor of the cellar and put her hands over her face. Her grandmother had spent 40 years quietly gathering pieces of motorcycle history that nobody else thought were worth saving. She'd bought them when they were cheap, when men were throwing them out or selling them for scrap, when nobody understood what they were going to become, and she'd hidden them down here, under a workbench, in a concrete garage on a dirt road outside a town that had forgotten her name. There was a small ledger on the bottom shelf. Marlo opened it. Every piece was cataloged, date acquired, price paid, provenance, notes about condition and restoration, and at the bottom in pencil, dated 1998, a single line in Evangeline's handwriting. Whatever it's worth, it's hers now. Use it well. Marlo climbed back up the ladder. She closed the trap door. She sat down on the workbench and looked at the Indian 4 sitting in the center of the garage under the lights. She thought about her grandmother riding that bike across the desert in 1943 with classified documents hidden in the saddlebags. Thought about her standing on a podium in 1937, accepting a trophy while men in the crowd tried to figure out how a woman had just beaten them. Thought about her coming out here alone year after year working on pieces of history that nobody else cared about, knowing she'd never see them written again, knowing she was preserving something for a person who hadn't been born yet. Marlo sat there until the sky outside the door started to turn gray, until she heard the sound of engines coming up the dirt road. Not trucks this time, motorcycles. She stood up and walked to the door. The sun was just coming up over the ridge. The light was thin and pale, turning the desert gold. 11 bikes came up the road in a long, slow line. The sound of them rolled across the hillside like distant thunder. The man at the front was riding a Road King so old the chrome was almost gone. He pulled into the clearing and stopped. The others pulled in behind him and shut down their engines one by one. The silence that followed was almost louder than the sound had been. The man got off his bike and walked toward her. He was in his late 50s, gray beard, broad shoulders, wearing a leather vest with patches that matched the ones on Marlo's jacket. His name was Judah Flint. Everyone called him Judd. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her face. Really looked at her. "You've been crying, Beckett." "No, yeah, you have. Come here." He stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. He smelled like leather and tobacco and engine oil, like every road she'd ever ridden. Marlo held on for a long second, longer than she meant to. When she pulled back, she pointed at the garage. "You're going to want to see what's in there." The Iron Maidens walked through the garage door one by one, men and women, most of them gray now, all of them wearing colors. Nobody spoke. Judd stood in front of the Indian 4 for a full minute without moving. One of the women, a big silver-haired woman called Ox, put her hand over her mouth. "Evangeline Beckett, Ox said quietly. I knew her name from the books, from the vintage circuit. I never knew where she ended up. Marlowe's voice was steady. She ended up here. She left it to me. And someone is trying to take it. Judd turned around. Then they're not going to take it. He walked back outside and pulled out his phone. By 8 in the morning, there were 30 bikes in the clearing. By 9, there were 50. By 10, the first news van came up the road. Marlowe didn't know who had called the press. It didn't matter. At noon, Holden Ravencroft came back. He came in his own car this time, a black SUV. He came alone. He probably thought it would look better. He stopped halfway up the road when he saw the bikes lining both sides of the clearing. He got out slowly. A second car pulled up behind him. A man in a sheriff's uniform stepped out. The sheriff walked up to the garage. His name was Tate Morgan. Marlowe had known him since he was a deputy 20 years ago. Mrs. Beckett, Sheriff Morgan said, Mr. Ravencroft here says he has a purchase agreement and a right of access to this property. Marlowe looked at Holden, then she looked back at the sheriff. He has neither. He's also saying the county is going to condemn this parcel for environmental contamination. The county hasn't filed any such thing. I checked the clerk's office at 6 this morning. I have a friend there, Sheriff Morgan turned to Holden. Holden opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There has been a misunderstanding. That was when the man from the Smithsonian got out of a third car. He was a small man in a gray suit. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm. He walked up to the sheriff and introduced himself and asked very politely if he could see the motorcycle. His name was Dr. Baxter Aldridge. He'd been called by Ox, who knew him from her years on the vintage circuit. Marlowe looked at Holden. Holden looked at the Smithsonian curator. Then he looked at the 50 motorcycles parked in the clearing. Then he looked at the news camera setting up near the road. He got back in his SUV without another word. Marlowe took Dr. Aldridge into the garage. Dr. Baxter Aldridge stood in front of the Indian for what felt like an eternity. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there with his hands clasped behind his back looking at the motorcycle like it was a painting in a museum. Marlowe watched him from the doorway. The other bikers had stayed outside, giving the man space. She could hear them talking in low voices, the occasional laugh, the click of a lighter. Finally, Dr. Aldridge reached into his jacket and pulled out a small magnifying loupe. He bent down and examined the brass plate on the frame, traced his finger along the engine numbers stamped into the metal, studied the paint on the fuel tank, the gold pinstriping the number 7. He stood up and turned around. Mrs. Beckett, this is the bike Evangeline Beckett rode at Daytona in 1937. Yes, this is the most significant pre-war American motorcycle that has surfaced in 40 years. He gestured at the photographs on the wall, at the trophies lining the shelves. The Smithsonian would like to discuss an acquisition. We are also prepared to discuss a loan arrangement that would keep the bike in your ownership, but allow it to be displayed in our collection. How much? Dr. Aldridge named a number. It was more money than Marlowe had ever heard come out of a human mouth in her direction. More money than she'd made in 30 years running the shop. More money than the house had been worth before the foreclosure. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. I'll think about it. She walked past him, out of the garage, past the bikers and the news cameras, and the sheriff still standing by his car looking confused. She walked up to Holden Ravencroft's SUV just as he was putting it in reverse. She knocked on the window. He looked at her through the glass. For a second, she thought he might just drive away. But he lowered the window. My grandmother wrote everything down, Marlowe said, every time your father came here, every threat he made, every forged document he tried to use. She kept records, dates, names, witnesses. Holden's jaw tightened. If you come back here again, those records go to the state attorney's office, and I'll make sure every news station in Arizona gets a copy. She stepped back from the car. Holden stared at her for another long moment. Then he put the window up and drove away. He didn't come back. Marlowe walked back to the garage. Judd was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her. You good? Yeah. He nodded, didn't ask any more questions. That was one of the things she'd always liked about him. The news van left an hour later. The sheriff left after that. Dr. Aldridge gave her his card and told her to call him when she'd made a decision. He didn't push, didn't try to sell her on it, just shook her hand and left. By mid-afternoon, most of the bikers had cleared out too. They had jobs to get back to, lives to return to, but they'd been there when it mattered, and that was enough. Judd stayed. So did Ox. So did a handful of others who didn't have anywhere they needed to be. Marlowe sat on the workbench and looked at the Indian 4. "You gonna sell it?" Judd asked. "I don't know." He pulled up an old stool and sat down, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, offered her one. She shook her head. He lit his own and blew smoke toward the ceiling. "Your grandma was a hell of a writer. You knew about her." Judd shook his head. "Heard the name? Read about her in some old magazine article years ago. Didn't know she was your grandma. Didn't know any of this existed." He gestured at the trophies, the photographs. She kept it quiet. "Yeah," Marlowe said. "She did." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, Ox was telling a story to the others, her voice carrying through the open door. Someone laughed. "What are you going to do?" Judd asked. Marlowe looked at him. Then she looked back at the bike. "I'm going to read the rest of the journal. Then I'm going to figure it out." Judd nodded, stubbed out his cigarette on the sole of his boot, and tucked the butt into his pocket. "We'll be around if you need us." "I know." He stood up and walked to the door. Stopped. Turned back. "Beckett, whatever you decide, don't let some museum tell you what that bike's worth. Your grandma didn't hide it for 26 years so it could sit behind glass." He walked out before she could respond. Marlowe sat alone in the garage as the afternoon light shifted and the shadows grew long. She picked up the journal again and kept reading. The entries after the war were different, shorter, more practical, less about racing and more about building, about collecting. Evangeline had opened this garage in 1946. She'd bought the land, she'd built the structure herself with help from a few men who owed her favors. She'd insulated it, sealed it, made it airtight, and then she'd started filling it. The journal listed every piece, where she'd bought it, how much she'd paid, why she thought it mattered. Crocker frame, acquired 1953, paid $75. Man didn't know what he had, thought it was junk. Brous Superior tank, acquired 1961, paid $200. Seller said it was from Lawrence's bike. I believe him. Vincent engine, acquired 1978, paid $500. Complete, unrestored, original parts. Nobody wants these anymore. They will. Page after page, year after year, a lifetime of quiet accumulation. And then in 1962, the tone changed. Man came to the property today. Thaddeus Ravencroft, banker from town, said he'd heard about the Indian, offered me $10,000. I told him no. He said I didn't know what I had. I told him I knew exactly what I had. He left angry. Marlowe turned the page. Ravencroft came back today. Brought 2 men with him. Showed me a document. Said I owed the bank money. Said he had a lien on the property. I called the sheriff. Sheriff looked at the document. It was a forgery. Sheriff made them leave. Ravencroft threatened to come back with a real claim. I told him to try. Another entry dated 1973. Ravencroft built himself a bank. Used money from somewhere, probably not clean. He's a careful man. Knows how to make things look legitimate. But I wrote everything down, just in case. The journal went on. Entries about other men who'd come looking for the bike, collectors, dealers, people who'd heard rumors. Evangeline had turned them all away. She kept everything locked up, hidden, waiting. The final entry was dated July 1998, 1 month before the letter. I'm 90 years old. I don't have much time left. Marlowe doesn't know about any of this. She's been writing her whole life, but she doesn't know where she came from. I think that's my fault. I should have told her. But I was afraid she'd think I was crazy, afraid she'd sell it all, afraid she wouldn't understand. But I'm leaving it to her anyway, because the Beckett women have always been stronger than we think we are. And because if she's reading this, it means she needs it. Number 7 belongs on the road, not in a museum, not in some collector's garage. On the road. I hope she remembers that. Marlowe closed the journal. She sat there for a long time, holding it in her lap, staring at nothing. Then she stood up and walked to the trap door. Opened it. Climbed down into the cellar. The parts were still there, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting. She pulled the cloth off the Crocker frame again, ran her hand along the metal. It was cold and smooth and perfect. She thought about what Judd had said, about what the bike was worth, about what her grandmother had wanted. She climbed back up and closed the trap door. She knew what she was going to do. The next morning, Marlowe called Dr. Aldridge. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Beckett, have you made a decision? I'm not selling the Indian." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand. If you'd like to discuss a loan arrangement, I'm not loaning it either. Another pause, longer this time. May I ask why? Because my grandmother said it belongs on the road, and I think she was right. Dr. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. I respect that, he said finally. But if you ever change your mind, the offer stands. I won't. But I have other pieces you might be interested in. She told him about the vault, about the parts, about the collection her grandmother had spent 40 years building. Dr. Aldridge listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, I'd like to see them. Come back tomorrow. Bring someone who knows what they're looking at. He said he would. Marlowe hung up and sat on the porch of the garage looking out at the desert. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning cool. A lizard darted across the dirt and disappeared under a rock. She thought about Claire, wondered where she was, if she was okay, if she ever thought about what she'd done. Probably not. Marlowe pulled out the flip phone and stared at it for a while. She had Claire's old number saved in the contacts. She could call, leave a message, say something. She put the phone away. Some things couldn't be fixed with a phone call. Dr. Aldridge came back the next day with two other people. A woman in her 40s who introduced herself as a curator from the National Motorcycle Museum. A man in his 60s who didn't give his name, but had the look of someone who'd spent his whole life around old bikes. Marlowe took them down into the vault. They went through every piece, examined them, discussed them in low voices, took notes. The woman photographed everything with a small digital camera. When they came back up, the unnamed man looked at Marlowe with something close to awe. Your grandmother knew what she was doing. Yeah, Marlowe said. She did. Dr. Aldridge made an offer. Not for everything, just for the pieces that would fit in a museum. The Crocker frame, the Brow Superior tank, the Vincent engine, a few others. He named a number. It was less than what the Indian alone would have been worth, but it was enough. Enough to pay off the debts Claire had left in her name. Enough to buy a small house somewhere. Enough to live on for a while, Marlowe agreed. They arranged for the pieces to be picked up the following week. Professional handlers, climate-controlled transport, insurance, the whole thing. Dr. Aldridge shook her hand before he left. Your grandmother would be proud. Marlowe didn't know if that was true, but she nodded anyway. After they left, she sat in the garage and looked at the empty spaces on the shelves where the parts had been. It felt strange, like she'd given away pieces of her grandmother, but she still had the Indian. And she still had the trophies, and she still had the journal. That was enough. Over the next few months, Marlowe used the money to settle everything. She paid off the loans Claire had taken out in her name, paid the lawyers who tried to fight the foreclosure and failed, paid the credit card companies and the collection agencies and everyone else who'd been calling for 2 years. When it was done, she had enough left to put a down payment on a small house at the bottom of the dirt road. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, a porch that looked up at the garage on the hill, a yard that was mostly dirt and sagebrush. It was the first place that had felt like hers in a long time. She spent her days working on the garage, fixing the roof where it leaked, painting the walls, replacing the old fluorescent lights with new ones that didn't hum. She built new shelves for the trophies, cleaned each one by hand, polished the brass and silver until they shone. She framed the photographs properly, hung them on the back wall in a grid. Her grandmother at 20, at 30, at 40, a life captured in black and white. And she left the Indian 4 exactly where it was, in the center of the room, under the lights. On a low wooden platform she built herself. She made a placard for it, simple, clean, Indian 4. 1936, Daytona 1937 national champion. Number 7, rider Evangeline Beckett. This bike is not for sale. She hung a sign over the garage door, hand-painted by a woman Ox knew who did work for museums. Evangeline Beckett Workshop, established 1946. People started showing up. Not a lot, just a few at first. Bikers who'd heard about the Indian, collectors who'd read about the Smithsonian acquisition, history buffs who wanted to see the trophies. Marlowe let them in, gave them tours, told them stories about her grandmother that she was still learning herself. And then one day a woman showed up with a kid. The kid was 15, skinny, quiet. He stood behind his mother and didn't make eye contact. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Webb, said she'd read about Marlowe in the paper, said her son Silas loved motorcycles but didn't have anyone to teach him, said she'd heard Marlowe used to run a shop. Marlowe looked at the kid, He was staring at the Indian 4 like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. You know anything about bikes? Marlowe asked. The kid shook his head. You want to? He nodded. Marlowe looked at the mother, then back at the kid. Come back tomorrow. 8 in the morning. Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty. The kid showed up the next day at 7:45. Marlowe put him to work, taught him how to clean a carburetor, how to gap a spark plug, how to read an engine by the sound it made. He didn't say much, just listened, watched, did what she told him to do. After 2 weeks, she taught him how to rebuild a carburetor from scratch. After a month, he could do it without instructions. She started paying him, not much, just enough to make it official, enough to make him show up every day like it mattered. And then other people started asking, young women mostly, in their 20s, looking for work, looking for someone to teach them. Marlowe took on 3 more. Bryn, Reese, Fallon. Bryn was a welder from Tucson. She could torch cut a frame in half and put it back together better than it started. Reese had dropped out of engineering school at Arizona State. She was better with numbers than anyone Marlowe had ever met. Fallon had been a Marine, fixed Humvees in Iraq. She didn't talk about it much, but she knew her way around an engine. The 4 of them turned the garage into something else. Not just a museum, a working shop. They took in old bikes, American iron from before 1960, Harleys and Indians and anything else that rolled through the door with history in its frame. They restored them, some they kept, some they sold, some they donated to museums that wanted them. The work was hard, the pay wasn't great, but it felt right. Marlowe worked alongside them, taught them everything she knew, everything her grandmother had known and never had the chance to teach her. Silas barely spoke for the first month. Then one day he asked a question about timing chains, and after that he didn't stop. He soaked up knowledge like a sponge, stayed late, came in early, worked through weekends. Marlowe saw herself in him, the kid who didn't fit anywhere else, the one who made sense only when there was grease under their nails and an engine in front of them. She gave him more responsibility, let him lead a rebuild on a 1948 Panhead, watched him figure it out on his own. By the end of 6 months, he was better than most mechanics twice his age. The garage became something people talked about, a place where old bikes got a second life, where young people learned a dying trade, where a 75-year-old woman with white hair and scarred knuckles taught the next generation how to keep history running. But Marlowe still hadn't ridden the Indian. She told herself it was because the bike was too valuable, too important, too fragile. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that she was afraid she'd crash it, afraid she'd damage it, afraid she wouldn't live up to what her grandmother had been. The Indian sat on its platform in the center of the garage, beautiful and untouched, and every day Marlowe walked past it and felt the weight of something unfinished. Judd noticed. He always noticed. He showed up one Saturday morning in October. No warning. Just pulled into the clearing on his old Road King and walked into the garage like he owned the place. Marlowe was under a 1952 Hydroglide changing the oil. Silas was at the workbench rebuilding a transmission. The others were off for the weekend. Judd looked at the Indian. Then he looked at Marlowe. You gonna ride that thing, or you just gonna stare at it for the rest of your life? Marlowe slid out from under the Hydroglide and wiped her hands on a rag. I'll ride it when I'm ready. Judd snorted. You've been ready your whole damn life, Beckett. You're just scared. I'm not scared. Yeah, you are, and that's fine. But your grandma didn't hide that bike for 26 years, so you could be scared of it. He walked over to the platform, ran his hand along the fuel tank. She left you a note, didn't she? In that journal, yeah. What did it say? Marlowe didn't answer right away. She stood up and walked over to the shelf where the journal sat behind glass. She opened the case and flipped to the last page. She read it out loud. Number 7 belongs on the road. Not in a museum, not in some collector's garage. On the road. Judd nodded. So what are you waiting for? Marlowe looked at the bike. Then she looked at Judd. I don't know. Yes, you do. You're waiting for permission. From your grandma, from me, from someone. But nobody's going to give it to you, Beckett. You got to take it. He walked to the door and stopped. I'll be here tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. If you want to ride, we'll ride. If you don't, that's fine too. But stop pretending you're protecting that bike. You're just protecting yourself. He left. Silas looked up from the transmission. You gonna do it? Marlowe didn't answer. She went back to the Hydroglide and finished the oil change. That night, she sat on the porch of her house and looked up at the garage on the hill. The lights were off, the door was closed, but she could picture the Indian sitting there in the dark waiting. She thought about her grandmother riding that bike across the desert in 1943, thought about her racing it at Daytona in 1937, thought about all the miles it had covered, all the roads it had seen, and she thought about the last thing Evangeline had written in the journal. I hope she remembers that. Marlo stood up, walked inside, set her alarm for 5 in the morning. She was going to ride. She woke up before the alarm, couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts running through her head. She made coffee, drank it black on the porch while the sky turned from black to gray to pale blue. At 5:30, she walked up the hill to the garage. Judd was already there. So was Ox. So was Silas, even though she hadn't asked him to come. They didn't say anything, just watched her unlock the door and push it open. The Indian sat where it always sat, gleaming under the overhead lights. Marlo walked over to it, put her hand on the seat. The leather was cold and cracked and perfect. She'd read the journal a dozen times. She knew what her grandmother had written about how to start the bike, how to ride it. Number 7 responds best to a firm throttle and a gentle clutch. She likes to run. Marlo wheeled the bike off the platform and out into the clearing. The weight of it surprised her. Heavier than she remembered. Solid. Judd handed her a helmet. She put it on, pulled on her gloves, zipped up the leather jacket with all the patches her grandmother had never seen. She swung her leg over the seat and settled her weight. The frame creaked. The suspension compressed. She put her foot on the kickstart. First kick. Nothing. Second kick. A cough, a sputter. Third kick. The engine caught. It sounded like a heartbeat. Deep, strong, steady. Marlo sat there for a moment feeling it. The vibration in her hands. The rumble in her chest. The heat coming off the engine. Then she eased the clutch out and gave it throttle. The bike rolled forward, smooth, responsive, alive. She rode out of the clearing and down the dirt road, slow at first, testing the brakes, feeling the balance, learning the machine. The road leveled out. The dirt turned to pavement. The sun came up over the hills and turned the desert gold. Marlo opened the throttle. The Indian answered. It didn't hesitate, didn't falter. It just ran, fast and smooth and sure. She rode for an hour, through the hills, along the empty highway, past the places she'd ridden 1,000 times on other bikes. But this was different. This was history. This was her grandmother's hands on the bars, her grandmother's weight in the seat, her grandmother's road, and now it was hers too. She didn't cry, but she smiled. When she came back, Judd and Ox and Silas were still standing in the clearing waiting. She pulled up and shut the engine down, swung the kickstand out, stepped off. Judd walked over, arms crossed, face expressionless. How was she? She's good. Yeah, she is. Marlo pulled off her helmet. Her hair was plastered to her head. Her face was flushed. Her hands were shaking just a little. She looked at Silas. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, hands in his pockets, trying not to look like he was watching. She walked over to him. She took the brass key off the chain around her neck, the key her grandmother had left her, the key that had opened the garage, the key that had unlocked everything. She put it in his hand. Lock up tonight, kid. Silas stared at her. What? You heard me. But it's a key, Silas, not the bike, just the key. You lock up. You open up. You take care of this place when I'm not here. She closed his hand around it. You've earned it. Silas didn't say anything, just stood there with the key in his fist, looking at her like she'd just handed him the world. Marlo walked back into the garage. The sun was fully up now. Light poured through the open door and made everything inside glow. She looked at the trophies, the photographs, the empty platform where the Indian had been. She thought about her grandmother, about Claire, about all the roads she'd ridden and all the ones still ahead. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. 18 months later, the garage had become something more than Marlo ever expected. The sign over the door had faded a little in the Arizona sun, but the words were still clear. Evangeline Beckett Workshop, established 1946. People came from all over. Not crowds, not tourists, but the right kind of people. Bikers who'd heard about the Indian, Mechanics who wanted to see how a woman in her 70s ran a shop that specialized in bikes most people had never heard of. Young riders looking for someone to teach them something real. Marlowe had turned the garage into exactly what her grandmother had probably imagined it could be. A place where history wasn't just preserved, it was kept alive. The Indian 4 still sat in the center of the room on its platform. But now there was a difference. Dust on the tires, a thin film of road grime on the chrome, oil spots on the concrete underneath. The bike got ridden now, once a month, sometimes twice. Marlowe took it out early in the morning when the desert was still cool and the roads were empty. She'd ride for an hour, sometimes two, and then bring it back and clean it carefully, checking every bolt, every connection, making sure it was ready for the next ride. It wasn't a museum piece anymore, it was a motorcycle. The workshop had grown too. 4 full-time apprentices now. Silas had turned 16 and was running point on most of the rebuilds. He barely talked unless it was about engines, but when he did talk, people listened. Bryn had brought in metalworking tools and set up a welding station in the back corner. She could fabricate parts that didn't exist anymore, remake brackets and mounts, and frames that had been written off as too far gone. Reese handled the business side, invoices, inventory, customer relations. She'd built a website that actually brought in work from across the state. Fallon ran the day-to-day operations, scheduled jobs, managed timelines, kept everyone on task. She was quiet but firm, and nobody argued with her. Marlowe supervised, taught, fixed the problems they couldn't figure out. But mostly she let them work. They were good, better than she'd been at their age, and watching them brought something close to peace. The work came in steady. Old Harleys, a few Indians, a 1947 chief that had been sitting in a barn in New Mexico for 30 years, a knucklehead that someone's grandfather had ridden in World War II and then parked in a garage and never touched again. They took it all, tore it down, rebuilt it, made it run. Some bikes they sold, some they kept, a few they donated to museums that asked politely and had the space to display them properly. The money was enough, not extravagant, but enough to keep the lights on and pay everyone a fair wage. Enough for Marlowe to live simply in the little house at the bottom of the hill. She got up every morning at 6, made coffee, walked up to the garage, unlocked the door, turned on the lights, started the day. It was a good life, better than she'd had in years. But there was still something unfinished. Claire. Marlowe hadn't heard from her daughter in over 3 years. No calls, no letters, nothing. She'd searched online a few times, found a few social media profiles that might have been her. A woman in Nevada with the same name, a profile picture too blurry to be sure. No posts, no activity. Marlowe had thought about reaching out, typing a message, saying something. But every time she started, she stopped. Because she didn't know what to say. And because part of her wasn't sure she wanted to. Some wounds didn't heal. You just learned to live with them. But on a Thursday afternoon in late October, a car pulled up to the garage. An old sedan, rust on the fenders, dented bumper. Marlowe was inside showing a customer the Indian. The man was a collector from Flagstaff interested in the restoration work they'd done on a 1950 Panhead. He was asking questions about original parts versus reproductions when she heard the car door slam outside. She excused herself and walked to the door. A woman was standing by the car, thin, worn down, hair pulled back in a ponytail, jeans and a faded t-shirt. It took Marlowe a full 3 seconds to recognize her. Claire. Her daughter looked older. Not just 3 years older, 10 years, maybe more. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, hollows in her cheeks. Her hands were shaking. They stared at each other across the distance, 50 yards, maybe less. It felt like miles. Claire didn't move, didn't walk toward the garage, just stood there by the car with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. Marlowe stepped outside. The customer was still inside looking at the Panhead. Silas was at the workbench pretending not to watch. Marlowe walked halfway to the car, stopped. Claire, Mom. Her voice was small, uncertain. They stood there in silence. The wind picked up, pulling dust across the clearing. A hawk circled overhead. I saw the article, Claire said finally. In the paper, about the garage, about Grandma's bike. Marlowe didn't respond. I didn't know, Claire continued, about any of it, about what she did, about what she left you. You didn't ask. Claire flinched. No, I didn't. Another silence. Longer this time. I'm sorry, Claire said, for what I did, for the loans, for everything. Marlo looked at her daughter, really looked at her, saw the exhaustion, the guilt, the weight of 3 years spent running. Where's your husband gone? Left me in Reno 2 years ago, took what was left and disappeared. And you've been there since. Claire shook her head. Vegas for a while, then Phoenix, working at a diner, barely making rent. Why are you here? I don't know. I just needed to see you, to tell you I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know. Marlo felt something shift in her chest, anger, grief, something else she couldn't name. You destroyed my life, Claire, I know. I lost everything because of you, I know. And you ran, you disappeared, you didn't even call. Claire's eyes filled with tears. I couldn't. I was too ashamed. I thought if I could fix it, if I could make the money back, somehow I could come back and make it right. But I couldn't. And the longer I waited, the harder it got. And then I saw the article and I realized you didn't need me to fix it. You already did. Marlo didn't say anything. Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I should go. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. That's all. She turned toward the car. Marlo watched her reach for the door handle. And then she heard her grandmother's voice in her head. Not a memory, just the words from the letter. The Beckett women have always been hard on themselves and easy on the people who hurt us. Marlo took a breath. Let it out. Claire. Her daughter stopped, turned. You want coffee? Claire stared at her. What I'm asking if you want coffee. There's a pot inside. Claire's mouth opened. Closed. I don't understand. Marlo walked toward her, stopped a few feet away. I'm not saying I forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you're still my daughter. And you came back. That takes more courage than running ever did. So I'm offering you coffee. And maybe if you wanted a chance to learn what Grandma tried to teach us. Claire's eyes filled again. She nodded. Couldn't speak. Marlo turned and walked back to the garage. She didn't look to see if Claire followed, but she heard the footsteps behind her on the gravel. They sat on the porch of the garage and drank coffee in silence. Claire held the cup with both hands like she was trying to warm herself. The customer from Flagstaff left. Waved to Marlo on his way out. Said he'd be in touch about the panhead. Silas walked past with a toolbox, glanced at Claire, didn't say anything. After a while, Claire spoke. The bike's beautiful. Yeah, it is. Grandma really rode that all over the country. During the war, she was a courier for the OSS. Claire looked at her. I didn't know that. Nobody did. She kept it quiet. Why? Marlo shrugged. I think she thought nobody would believe her. Or maybe she didn't want the attention. She was like that. Claire nodded, stared into her coffee. What are you going to do now? Marlo asked. I don't know. Go back to Phoenix, I guess. Keep working, try to figure things out. You got a place to stay. A motel, week to week. Marlo thought about it, thought about the extra room in the house at the bottom of the hill, the one she'd been using for storage. She thought about her grandmother's words, about being hard on yourself and easy on the people who hurt you. She thought about forgiveness, whether it was something you gave or something you just stopped withholding. You can stay here for a while if you want, Marlo said, just until you get on your feet. Claire looked at her. Are you serious? There's a room, it's small, but it's got a bed. Mom, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. Why? Because you're my daughter, and because holding on to this anger isn't doing me any good. Claire set down her coffee cup, put her face in her hands, started to cry. Marlo let her, didn't reach out, didn't comfort her, just sat there and waited. After a while, Claire looked up. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're going to work for it. We need help in the shop. Cleaning, organizing, whatever needs doing, you'll earn your keep. I don't know anything about motorcycles. You'll learn. Claire nodded, wiped her face again. They sat there for a while longer, not talking, just sitting. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The weeks that followed were awkward. Claire moved into the spare room, started showing up at the garage every morning, swept floors, organized parts, made coffee runs, stayed out of the way. She didn't talk much. Neither did Marlo. They moved around each other carefully like two people trying not to touch a wound. But slowly things began to shift. Claire started asking questions. about the bikes, about the work, about what Evangeline had done. Marlo started answering, showing her things, teaching her the basics. Claire wasn't a natural. She struggled with the technical stuff, couldn't tell a carburetor from a clutch. But she tried, and she didn't quit. Silas warmed up to her first. He showed her how to clean parts properly, how to sort bolts by size, how to read a parts diagram. Brennan and Reese were more cautious, but eventually they came around. Fallon took the longest. She didn't trust easy. But when Claire proved she was serious, Fallon started giving her real tasks. 3 months in, Claire rebuilt her first carburetor. Under Silas's supervision, it took her 6 hours and she made a dozen mistakes. When she was done, she looked at Marlo, held up the greasy part like it was gold. Will it work? Marlo walked over, examined it, turned it in her hands, looked for the mistakes she knew were there. She found three. Small things. Things that wouldn't matter much. Things Claire would learn to catch next time. Put it in, Marlo said. Claire's hands shook as she installed it. Silas watched but didn't help. This was hers. When the bike started and ran clean, Claire didn't move. Just stood there staring at the engine like she couldn't believe it. Then she turned to Marlo, eyes wet. I did it. Marlo nodded. Yeah, you did. It was the first time in 3 years she'd been proud of her daughter. She didn't say it out loud, but Claire knew. Some things didn't need words. By spring, Claire had moved out of the spare room and into a small apartment in town. She kept working at the garage, kept learning. She'd never be a master mechanic, but she became part of the team. And slowly, carefully, she and Marlo began to rebuild something that looked almost like a relationship. It wasn't the same as before. It never would be. Too much had been broken. But it was something. One Sunday morning in April, Marlo decided it was time to ride the Indian again. She hadn't taken it out in over a month. The weather had been bad, rain and wind, not safe. But today was clear, cool, perfect. She wheeled the bike out of the garage at dawn. Judd had shown up the night before, said he'd ride with her. Ox, too. And Silas on a rebuilt 1956 Hydra-Glide they just finished. Claire stood by the door of the garage watching. You ever ridden? Marlo asked. Claire shook her head. Never. You want to learn? Claire looked at the bikes, then at Marlo. Really, really. Marlo walked over to a 1948 Panhead they'd restored a few months back. It was a smaller bike, easier to handle. She'd been keeping it around for teaching. She showed Claire the basics, how to sit, how to balance, how to work the clutch and the throttle. Claire was terrified. Her hands shook. She stalled the engine 3 times trying to get it into gear. But on the 4th try, she got it moving. She rode in a slow circle around the clearing. Maybe 10 miles an hour, wobbly, uncertain. But she stayed upright. When she came back and stopped, she was grinning. Marlo handed her a helmet. Follow us. Stay back. Don't try to keep up. Just ride. They rode out together, Marlo on the Indian, Judd on the Road King, Ox on her old Softail, Silas on the Hydra-Glide, Claire on the Panhead 50 yards back, taking it slow. They rode through the hills, along the empty highway, into the desert where the sagebrush stretched out forever and the sky was so big it hurt to look at. Marlo opened the throttle. The Indian responded like it had been waiting. The engine sang. The road disappeared beneath her. She thought about her grandmother, about all the miles Evangeline had ridden on this bike, all the roads, all the races, all the years. And she thought about the journal, about the last thing her grandmother had written. Number 7 belongs on the road. Marlo rode for 2 hours. When she finally turned back, the sun was high and hot. Claire was still behind them, keeping pace learning. They pulled back into the clearing and shut down the engines. The silence was huge. Claire got off the Panhead and pulled off her helmet. Her face was flushed. Her eyes were bright. That was incredible. Yeah, Marlo said, it was. They walked back into the garage together. Mother and daughter, not fixed, but not broken either. The months turned into a year. The garage thrived. Word spread. More work came in. They hired another apprentice, a kid from Tucson named Danny who could rewire an electrical system in his sleep. The Indian got ridden regularly now. Marlo took it out once a month, sometimes more. She stopped being afraid of it, stopped treating it like glass. It was a machine, built to run, and it ran beautifully. One afternoon in late summer, Marlo was sitting on the porch of the garage when a motorcycle pulled up. Not one of the regulars. Someone new. A woman in her 30s, leather jacket, road dust on her boots. She got off the bike and walked over. Mrs. Beckett, yeah. My name's Tessa. I rode up from Tucson. I heard about this place. About what you're doing here. Marlo nodded. You need work done? No, I was hoping I could work here. Marlo looked at her. You a mechanic. Learning, I've been wrenching on my own bikes for 5 years. But I want to learn the old stuff. The real stuff. You got experience some. Not enough. Marlo thought about it, looked at the woman's hands. Scarred, calloused, hands that had worked. Come back tomorrow. 8 a.m. We'll see what you know. Tessa smiled. Thank you. She got back on her bike and rode off. Silas walked out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. You gonna hire her, maybe, if she's serious? She rode all the way from Tucson. She's serious, Marlo nodded. Yeah, probably. The garage kept growing, more people, more work, more bikes brought back from the edge. Marlo thought sometimes about retiring, about selling the place, about spending her last years doing something easier. But every time she thought about it, she looked at the Indian force sitting on its platform, looked at the trophies on the wall, looked at Silas and Bryn and Reese and Fallon and Claire and all the others learning something that would disappear if someone didn't pass it on. And she stayed. One October morning, almost 3 years after she'd first opened the garage, Marlo walked up the hill and found Silas already there. He was 17 now, taller, broader, still quiet, but confident in a way he hadn't been when he started. He was standing in front of the Indian, just looking at it. You okay, kid? He turned. Yeah, just thinking about your grandma, about what she built, about what you're building. Marlo walked over and stood next to him. She left me a hell of a thing, Marlo said. Yeah, she did. And you're doing right by it. They stood there in silence for a moment. Then Silas held out his hand. In his palm was the brass key, the one Marlo had given him almost 3 years ago. I think it's time you gave this to someone else. Marlo looked at the key, then at Silas. You've earned it, kid. It's yours. He shook his head. It's not about earning it. It's about passing it on. That's what your grandma did. That's what you did. That's what this place is. He pressed the key into her hand. Give it to the next one who needs it. Marlo closed her fingers around the brass. It was warm, familiar. She nodded. That night, she sat on the porch of her house and looked up at the garage on the hill. The lights were off. The door was locked. But she could picture everything inside. The Indian, the trophies, the photographs, the workbenches covered in tools and parts, and the debris of a dozen ongoing projects. She thought about her grandmother, about the letter, about the instruction to not open the garage until she had nothing left. She'd had nothing, and now she had everything. Not money, not security, not the things she'd lost, but something better, something that would outlast her, a legacy, a road that kept going. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through her contacts, found Claire's name. She typed a message. You want to take the Indian out tomorrow? The response came back a minute later. Are you serious? Yeah, 6 a.m. Don't be late. Marlo put the phone away, smiled. The wind moved through the desert. The stars came out. The night settled in. And somewhere in the darkness, an engine waited to run. The next morning, Marlo and Claire rode together, mother and daughter, side by side on 2 pieces of history that had been saved from the scrap heap and given a second life. They rode into the desert as the sun came up. The road stretched out ahead of them, empty and endless. Marlo twisted the throttle. The Indian responded. Claire kept pace on the panhead. They rode until the morning was fully bright and the heat started to build. Then they turned back. When they pulled into the clearing, the others were waiting. Silas, Bryn, Reese, Fallon, Tessa, Danny, the next generation. Marlo shut down the engine, stepped off the bike. Her legs were sore. Her back ached. She was 76 years old and she felt every year of it. But she was smiling. Claire walked over. How was it? Good, really good. They stood there together looking at the garage, at the sign over the door, at the open bay where sunlight poured in and illuminated everything inside. Mom, Claire said quietly, thank you. For what? For giving me another chance. Marlo looked at her daughter, at the lines on her face, at the weight she still carried. We all deserve another chance, Marlo said. Your grandmother gave me one. I'm giving you one. Someday you'll give someone else one. Claire nodded, wiped her eyes. They walked into the garage together. Silas was already at the workbench tearing down a transmission. Bryn was welding in the back. Reese was on the phone with a customer. Fallon was checking the schedule. Marlo poured herself a cup of coffee and stood in the doorway watching them work. This was what her grandmother had built. Not just a garage, not just a collection. A place where broken things got fixed, where history stayed alive, where people who didn't fit anywhere else found a home. Marlo thought about the trap door, about the empty cellar underneath. She'd thought about filling it back up, storing things down there again. But she'd decided to leave it empty, a reminder that some spaces were meant to be open, ready for whatever came next. She finished her coffee, set the cup down, walked over to the workbench. Silas, she said, show me what you're working on. He walked her through the rebuild, explained the problem, showed her the solution. She listened, asked questions, nodded. Good work, she said finally. She walked back to the Indian, ran her hand along the fuel tank. The metal was still warm from the ride. She thought about taking it out again next week, maybe riding farther, maybe finding new roads. The bike had spent 90 years waiting, first for her grandmother to ride it, then for Marlo to find it, then for Marlo to be brave enough to use it. It wasn't waiting anymore. None of them were. The sun climbed higher, the day got hotter, the work continued, and in the center of the garage under the lights, the Indian 4 sat ready. Not a relic, not a memorial, a motorcycle, exactly where it belonged. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Marlo sat on the porch of her house and looked up at the garage on the hill. The lights were still on. She could see Silas through the open bay door, sweeping the floor, locking things down for the night. He'd grown into the role, not just as a mechanic, as a keeper of something bigger than himself. Marlo pulled out the journal. She'd kept it with her more and more lately, not to read, just to hold. She opened it to the last page, her grandmother's handwriting, steady, certain. Number 7 belongs on the road. I hope she remembers that. Marlo looked at the Indian through the garage door, dust on the tires, oil on the floor underneath. The way it should be. She thought about all the roads her grandmother had ridden, all the races she'd won, all the years she'd spent hiding this legacy away, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Evangeline had known. Somehow she'd known. The Beckett women always did. Marlo closed the journal, stood up, walked back into the house. Tomorrow she'd ride again. Maybe take Claire with her. Maybe teach Tessa how to handle the Indian. Maybe just go alone and feel the wind and the engine in the road. It didn't matter. The bike was alive now. The garage was alive. The legacy was alive. And the road went on. It always did. Somewhere in the desert, a coyote called. The stars came out bright and cold and infinite. And in the garage on the hill under the lights that never went out, number 7 waited. Ready for the next mile. Ready for the next rider. Ready for the road that had no end.